Right. Not these chairs.
How are you? Front row seats. Good afternoon, everyone.
All right. We make the paper. It's not bad.
Welcome, fellow
Well, I'm not
data geeks.
we'll have anything that.
Glad you all could join us. I think everybody in this room is probably a data geek, and if you're not, you're probably here for the free lunch, in which case we welcome the opportunity to convert you into a data geek. So we're delighted to have you here today to talk about open data. Open data is a critical resource. I think there's broad agreement around the need and the value of open data. Open data isn't only valuable for the government in terms of increasing efficiency and effectiveness and improving citizen services, but open data is also a key driver of innovation in the private sector. In fact, just yesterday I was at the Data Coalition event. I'll give a shout out to our friends at the Data Coalition. They had their data demo day, and they had Suzette Kent doing keynote remarks, and she kind of mentioned, I like the way that she put it. She said, data is what drives our innovation of the future. And I think that's, a good summary of the way that we all look at data. I think everybody in the room here sees the same opportunities in data and open data, and we're all have been proponents of open data for a long time. In fact, SIIA has been working in this game for about 20 years, so we're delighted to see the progress that we've made. But data is complex, and I think increasingly so. There's government data and there's private sector data, and I think there's a critical element of openness to data in both the government and the private sector. But in many cases, what we're seeing recently, even more so, this is something that's happened in the past, but government works with its own data and disseminates its own data that's created by the government, paid for by citizens, but they're also working very closely with industry. In some cases, gathering data from industry, working together on joint projects, public-private partnerships, and it's an opportunity for not only government but for citizens, because it improves services and it improves the overall effect of data and data analytics, and it's a driver. But it does create a bit of a challenge for open data policies. So it's been a while since we've had an open data event, but I heard about Rich's paper that he just introduced talking about hybrid data, and we had been talking about this for a while, so it seemed like a great opportunity to have this panel. I think the timing is really good with all the enthusiasm around open data, all the activity. I think this is perfectly timed, and it's right in the middle of the session, and there's a lot of work to get done. I know there's a lot of data bills before the Congress, so we're delighted to have this panel here today and this discussion. But before we get into that, I'd like to introduce, I'm delighted to announce that we're joined here today by Congressman Paul Mitchell from Michigan, and I think Congressman Mitchell has a unique perspective on data. He's a new member of Congress. He's a member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and he's a former small businessman. Congressman Mitchell, before he joined Congress, ran Ross Medical Education Center, which is a for-profit allied health school with 35 locations across 7 states, offering both campus and online programs. So I think that's a perfect example of a company that surely worked in data, and data was at the core of a business like that. Congressman Mitchell has already assumed a leadership role in the Congress. Although he's still in his first term, he was elected by his peers as the freshman representative to the GOP House leadership. So we're delighted to have Congressman Mitchell with us here today. I'd like to invite him up to give some remarks.
I'm glad everyone could make it today, and it's a pleasure to be here. As you said, I spent 35 years in private business. I saw a lot of evolution in data. Yes, I'm old enough to remember when we finally got dial-up. Yeah, that was cool. I thought it was really neat. The first spreadsheets. And yeah, you think back to the evolution we've had and the impact it's had on business. So when I retired from the company, we had 6,500 students. We talk with a whole lot more in terms of people interested in coming to school there. Without effective data, our ability to run that business and lead that business and be successful would have been impossible, especially in any kind of administrative costs that were reasonable. And if you're in a private for-profit business, the objective is to actually make a profit some days. So you want to keep your admin, the first thing to do is control your admin. Well, you do that by being able to access data that tells you what's successful and not. How it is you can, from marketing information to targeting students to be successful, provide services to students, what's successful and what's not. All that can be identified through data. Is a backbone for our country anywhere, from the national defense, securing our borders, effective businesses, pick whatever topic you want. And let's be honest about it, the growth of data and data gathering is exponential, which is why, even my, high-speed internet at home is challenged now with a 16-year-old, and there are days I just kind of shrug my shoulders and say, can I get my own T1? But that's not happening for the sake of social media. I'm a strong advocate of government transparency, but in my opinion, here's what we need to do on the issue of data, from the government perspective, and I suggest in the private sector. We've seen the fear that people have, the fears they have what's going on with data. We need to, working with you, make sure that data is accessible, that people understand what's going on with their data, the information is accessible, it's digestible, they can understand it, and it's beneficial. They see why it benefits them. Because what you're seeing right now are people saying, I'm not sure I want that data out there, and how do I make sure that data is not being used for something else? I sat through a hearing the other day on gathering of data in the census and what's going on with the census data. Despite some pretty strong laws in place, people are afraid of what's going on with their data. You saw the Facebook hearings and what went on with that. Now, I'll say it publicly, I was absolutely astonished that we had United States senators that didn't know how Facebook made money. Do you all watch that hearing? I went, oh my God, come on. But okay. But the underlying reality of that is there are people saying, wait a minute, where's my data going, how it's being used? And what's being gathered by the government, and how is that being used? And is it being secured? And what's being done to depersonalize it and protect it? Now, if you went on the street and you asked people today about that, they'd all look at you with a glazed over look. So while we use data and the importance it is in decision making, we also have a responsibility of explaining that to people in terms they can understand. And I say that because around here, a bill summary, if it's more than 3 pages, the odds of getting someone to read it go down dramatically. If you're really interested in it, you'll go to the side, but you'll go to the section-by-section analysis. We're asked, well, did you read the bill? Now, you all know this because you're from here. You know what a bill looks like. Delete section whatever, put in whatever, and you couldn't figure it out, and if depended on unless you went back to went to the law library. The reality is reading is a challenged thing in this country these days in terms of reading through all the technical information. My suggestion is we need to comply with the attorneys, but give users the option of, give me the bullet items of what this thing does. We need to explain to users what's happening with their data. And I think the College Transparency Act is a perfect example of the uncertainty that people have about data. We want to help people, and you guys support that, and I really appreciate that. We want to help people make decisions about the most important thing they'll do, in all likelihood, the most expensive thing they'll do, which is, we were talking about it, pay for college for their kids and hope they get a career. Hope they don't come back home and decide to live with you, right? No, go to work, please. Huge investment. If you have more than one kid, you have potentially more money invested in educating your children for a career than you will do in buying homes. Yet we provide them so little information about the likelihood of success. Try to find out what the graduation rate is for the architecture program at the University of Michigan. And if you can find that out, try to find out what the rate at which they get a job in architecture and how much money they make. But isn't that the reason they go to college? You know what? An awful lot of that information we have here at the federal government. Not all of it, but a lot of it. We can gather the rest. I believe we can, in fact, and you guys have supported that, depersonalize that, aggregate that by college, by program, by location, and share that with people so you're making a wise decision. Do you know what's stopping that? Anybody want to guess? Come on, this is interactive. I'll pick on you, like the military. Why are people saying, my God, we can't do that? What's that? Fear. What are you going to do with my data? This innate discussion, well, privacy. Now, let's be blunt about it. Anybody in this room think you have privacy? How many of you had the shopper card from the grocery store or the pharmacy? How many go into a Target store? Yeah, how many go into a Target store, and the moment you walk in the store, you get coupons? So they think the wizard does that? There's not anybody in this room, I can't buy information if I were out doing door-to-door campaigning that would tell me what you subscribe to, estimate of how much money you make based on where you shop. In some cases, I can get an idea of what types of things you shop for, like how many times you voted, based on when you voted, if you voted in a primary that had Democrats, Republicans, which like your party affiliation is, if you're a member, what national groups you're a member of, and what questions to start out with and knocking your door. They actually recommend questions in order to link with a voter to start a relationship. That's all available, by location, by household. Yet people don't know that. We haven't explained it to them, and you're afraid. That fear is going to stop us in this country from getting data the government has now and being able to use it productively to benefit them. So the challenge I lay down to all of you is, yeah, we can gather this data. We can, in bits and pieces, try to link it with government data. But what we have to do is we have to get people to understand, make it accessible that it benefits them, and make it digestible in terms of what it does. Show them how it's depersonalized. And show them how you protect it. Because we make huge investments in the government. One report, another report, gather this data, we have more reports. And if you have any question about that, I sat in the House Armed Services Committee, I sit on that committee. We had markup until 12:30 in the morning. I can't count the number of reports that we requested or demanded of the Department of Defense. Think about the number of reports that are generated by Congress, the data troves that exist. No one even knows they exist. What they could do. How you can be accessed by groups like yours. But until we get some agreement in terms of how it is we can explain to the users, the people that pay for the data or use your services, what's going to happen with their data, how we're going to protect their data, how we're going to depersonalize it, how it's not going to be abused, we have a problem on our hands. And the one thing that we need to continue to get is we are the society we are because we are productive. We use information productively. We have to be able to access that and share it, and people feel safe. Otherwise, people fear we're going to the days of George Orwell. And that's simply not going to help your industry. It's not going to help the government. Some of you know I did the floor debate and led the discussion of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which is something that Paul Ryan advocated, sponsored the bill. The speaker generally doesn't go to the floor and be the floor manager for a bill, so send Mikey there. I went and did it, and did it both rules on the floor. What do you think happened when this came out, that the information came out, I was the floor manager behind that bill and supported it? What do you think happened? Every wackadoodle on the earth came out saying, oh my God, you're going to invade my privacy, the government's taking over. All because we want to have policy making at the federal government based on evidence, based on data, and not based on someone's wild idea that day. You'd be amazed at the set of comments I got. You thought I was violating the basic rules of man. So you guys can help with that challenge. Because to be honest with you, they're more likely to believe you than they are the government. What's Congress's approval rating? Barely above that of, you'd rather go see a veterinarian have your teeth pulled than you would necessarily come to a hearing in Congress some days or watch one. So you folks, but again, let me stress, in my opinion, the theme is make the information accessible, make it digestible, make it beneficial to the people that's sharing their data, and show them how you protect their data and depersonalize it. Then we can be more effective in what we do. Otherwise, we're going to run into a lot of roadblocks and make some bad decisions. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I will get out of your hair because you had real things to do. I think I was asked to talk for 5 minutes. Did I violate that grossly? But I appreciate it, and anything we can do in our office to assist, please let us know. We're happy to support because I think it's an important thing. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Congressman. The Congressman makes some very important points that we didn't gather here today to talk about, but I think it's really useful to have highlighted. And frankly, I mean, you can't really have a debate today about data. You can't talk about data without addressing the privacy aspect that Congressman just raised. So I think it's worth noting, and it's something that SIIA works, I spend most of my time probably in that aspect of data, personal data, PII. That's a slightly different set of data geeks probably than the folks we have in the room today, but it's still data, and some of us work on all of it. The Congressman makes an excellent point about the need to make sure we're protecting personal information, and that we're being upfront about how we're using it, and I think that applies not only to the private sector but to the government. So I think that's a that's a message that fits very well with what we're talking about today in terms of open data. So diving into our discussion about open data, I'd like to turn it over to the panel in a little bit, but first I'll give an introduction. I think today in this panel we've got, if Adam had a bow tie, it would be great. We'd have 3 guys in bow ties, and it would have been the first time ever I had a panel with 3 bow ties, but should have planned it. We've got 3 gentlemen here today that have, I think collectively, probably over half a century worth time spent working on data policy, so myself included, so I'll put lump myself in there. Many of us have been working together for many years, and we've kind of evolved open data policy together, so I think it's great to be able to assemble this group here today. We'll start out with Rich Beutel here, who, as I mentioned earlier, Rich just recently published this paper about hybrid data, and I know Rich brought some copies. They're out front, and it's available on the website, so Rich is going to be talking a bit about that. For those of you that don't know Rich, he is a long-time professional and a veteran of Capitol Hill, having worked on both the House side and the Senate side and the key committees of jurisdiction. Rich is the founder and leader of a firm that called Cyrrus Analytics. He's nationally recognized expert in IT acquisition with over 25 years private sector experience, and the founder and co-managing director of Dell Government Relations Team. So in addition to working and spending a couple decades on the Hill and working on the government side of data policy, Rich has extensive experience working in the private sector as well. We've also got Robert Shea, and Robert is the principal and member of Grant-Thornton's public sector practice. He runs their public sector practice and oversees their policy activities as well. He's on the organizational improvement team and has conducted performance management engagements with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. Now, when I met Robert, we were just talking beforehand, it was about 20 years ago. Robert was working for Senator Thompson, and Senator Thompson and Senator Lieberman at the time, around the 2001, were working on the E-Government Act. And when we were talking about, this is when we were talking about beginning to digitize government, and I've got a piece that we did back then, shortly after that time. This is an event that SIIA had long ago, Information Policy Summit, Government and Digital Content Era. So, in the beginning, Robert is one of the folks that, with myself, shares one of the dubious honors of working on the E-Government Act. So I think, we might dive into a little bit of that today, but we're going to try to be a little more forward-looking, I think, in our remarks. So Robert is also very experienced in the private sector and working both in the House side and the Senate for Senator Thompson, one of the key authors of that legislation, and worked for OMB, where he was working before joining Grant-Thornton. We're also joined by Adam Huftalen, who's the Senior Manager for Federal Government Affairs at RELX. You probably all know RELX better for some of their brands. Reed Elsevier is one of their key brands, and then LexisNexis. So a large and well-known company, not necessarily by their main name, but I think by their products and their excellent service. Been a leading data company and a partner with the federal government for a long time. So before joining RELX, Adam worked at a boutique government affairs relations consultancy, serving clients in the healthcare and foreign policy arenas. And prior to that, he was also on the Hill, working for a member of the House and the representative, the Committee on Foreign Affairs. So Adam is also experienced. I think so. We have a panel here of 3 gentlemen who have spent many years working on the government side, crafting data policies, and on the industry side, working with government from the outside. So I'd like to turn it over to them, and I guess we'll go, Rich, you give a bit of presentation about your paper, and we'll kind of go on down the line. I know Robert's going to talk about a lot of the good work he's been doing and some of the products he's been producing, and I think Adam will give us a good perspective of the work that you guys are doing with the government.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Rich Beutel. I am the managing principal of an IT consulting firm called Cyrrus Analytics. I don't represent Miley Cyrus. I had spent 10 years on the Hill, the last 5 at the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, working on the intersection of acquisition policy and IT policy. And while there, I had the privilege and the pleasure of working with many great visionary colleagues, energetic folks who were instrumental in the open data movement, moving forward with the Data Act. My colleague Hudson Hollister was just phenomenal with the work that he had done, and I emphatically embrace those outcomes of the Data Act and Chairman Iss's vision for the open government and open data policy. But things have moved along since then, and I think we need a more nuanced view of the basic goals and aspirations of the open data movement. And I was interested to take a look at this in terms of how it's evolved going over time. And like many things in government, we start with some very important and I think very critical goals and objectives, aspirations and goals. I mean, obviously, government data needs to support such key outcomes as transparency, innovation, and data-driven policy, evidence-based policy making. These are critical goals that I think we can all embrace going forward. But those goals and aspirations are certainly not unbounded. You know, we talk about transparency, but at the same time we acknowledge that it's not an absolute. I mean, the IC, the intelligence community, is very close hold with respect to its sources and methods. We've seen the damage to national security by WikiLeaks. There are things that don't and should not be in the public domain or broadly disseminated because of the potential for harm. And so we should drive transparency, but we should do it in a smart way and in a way that acknowledges the realities. Now, I think you can say the same thing for innovation, which is another key outcome of the open data policy and open data principles going forward. They, no question, drive innovation. And we'd had multiple conversations. I've had spirited conversations with Hudson and with Chairman Issa about driving broader government use and availability of data to create innovative ecosystems, new mashups, new business models, and the like. And that's very, very important. But at the same time, even innovation is subject to intellectual property rights. I mean, if you recollect, the Constitution calls out the need for patents, which at some level fundamentally curtail the free use of technology and the free use of ideas, because they too are instrumental in driving innovation. So that principle too is not unbounded. I mean, there are things that need to be considered going forward. And then finally, driving evidence-based policymaking by policymakers, by congressional staff and congressmen and senators to found good public policy and good government on data and information. And that's something we think is very, very necessary, and certainly the Evidence-Based Policy Act legislation based on the commission report that was pulled together has some very, very critical, interesting ideas. But even that has limitations. No one would suggest that we should turn the government over to Skynet, okay? And even Stephen Hawking once talked about how artificial intelligence could be one of the great threats to mankind. So to the extent that governance based on data, I mean, if you want the most efficient data, driven government activity, even that has limitations and has constraints. And so as you go forward and you look at the open data movement, I think you have to, the dialogue needs to mature, over time. Government has a way of taking great, important goals and aspirations and transforming them into process. And process then becomes the key thing that you're focused on. And sometimes you lose sight of those goals because you're wrapped around process. Process becomes the focus. And we've seen this over and over again in government. And sometimes process becomes more important than outcomes. You see this with the acquisition system, where adhering to process most often, and certainly in the context of IT deployments and development, lead to catastrophic consequences, and there's no accountability. Healthcare.gov was a catastrophic failure of IT deployment by the government, but there was no procurement problem with it. It followed the process to a T in many respects. I think that's where we are now with the open data movement writ large, is that we're now wrapped around the axle around process. And to that extent, we are dangerously close to making a mistake that we've made in the past, particularly with respect to the open source software movement, where we are looking at tech mandates that lock down in statute, that create rigidity and frankly become obsolete virtually from the very day that they're put into place. Now, I mentioned the open source software movement by way of example. I lived through that. So I was at Dell running the government relations function at that point in time. And I remember how the proprietary software companies were very up in arms about the open source movement. And there was a movement that all government software needed to be open source. And open source is a critical and important tool in the toolkit. But you can't have a tech mandate that says that all government software or government acquired or deployed software has to be open source and non-proprietary. We quickly found out that open source software was not a panacea, that it wasn't free, that it had severe technical problems, cyber vulnerabilities and the like. Now, I don't mean to overstate these problems because the business model of open source software does tend to work through those issues and did over time. But it got to the point where, working with OMB, we had to issue better guidance about government's use and adoption of open source software to ensure that it wasn't a mandate and that government's adoption, development, and deployment of technology wasn't locked into a specific business model. Open source software remains a critical tool in the government's toolkit. However, commercial off-the-shelf software plays an equal, if not greater, role in the successful deployment of technology and IT modernization going forward. I think the open data movement is perilously close to reaching a similar juncture in that respect. See, IT modernization now, we talk a lot about it, but it's at a crescendo. You're seeing multiple forces come together and people have finally realized that the government needs to embrace and deploy modern IT technology if they're going to do anything for the 21st century. Now, it's gone beyond just being a cybersecurity risk. The fact that we have hundreds of thousands of lines of COBOL-based mainframe infrastructure all over government is a serious problem. But when you look at IT modernization and the forces coming together, either through the President's management agenda or through executive order and the like, cybersecurity is just one key facet. Why do we want to modernize IT? Well, to drive effective citizen services, digital experience, and digital government into the 21st century so that we, as digital natives, I'm not one, but my daughter is, basically can have the same kind of experience consuming government and getting the benefit of government that they do in their daily lives as a normal day-to-day citizen. And so as we look at this landscape and this tectonic shift toward the adoption and deployment of modern IT infrastructure, the open data movement becomes a critical facet of that process. And the transparency and innovation concepts and outcomes become equally important going forward. We mentioned the evidence-based policy legislation. I think it's an excellent piece of legislation. The way I was thinking about it was Moneyball for government. If you've seen the movie, it's I think, a somewhat apt analogy. What we want to do is we want to drive effective public policy based on evidence, actionable evidence. Well, we talk about data as the new oil or data as the new asset. Data standing alone is not worth much. What you need is actionable information. And so where government, as we go forward in IT modernization, what they need, what the policymakers and thought leaders really require is not raw data, not data in specific formats, but actionable information upon which to base concrete and thoughtful policy decisions and the like. Now, you want them to have the best data for that purpose, regardless of its source. You need them to have public data that is created by government or paid for, funded by government, and there are specific and I think natural attributes that should be assigned to that. But you also want the government to have unfettered access access to private data as well. And what we're seeing, I think, which is a significant trend, both with respect to IT modernization, and evidence-based policymaking, is a merger of public and private data. And to that extent, we need to have a more nuanced approach, lest we fall into the trap that happened with the open source software movement. So a couple of examples. There's a program with the Department of Transportation where they're merging government data with Waze, the app Waze, to decrease traffic fatalities. So Waze's data is private data. They own it. They paid for it. They developed it, and they curate it and maintain its quality. And that's an essential part of that mashup of public and private data. And I think we can all agree that that effectiveness to drive down traffic fatalities is an important goal and objective. There's another program out of Virginia Beach where NIST and the private software company Esri have put together a mashup of public and private data called StormSense. And this is obviously to manage weather-related consequences for the Virginia Beach area and the like. And so it's something that I think adds tangible value to the residents for that region in the country. And we're seeing a bunch of these. These are just two recent examples that popped up. Now, there's another example with respect to acquisition policy. Now, the U.S. government is the largest consumer of goods and services in the world. We've heard that over and over again. And we have an acquisition process that is, by equal measure, cumbersome and red tape, but on the other hand, is founded on the expenditure of public money and taxpayer money, and so warrants careful oversight and careful management. I mean, if we are going to be prudent overseers of the taxpayer fist, we have to bring some forms of oversight into government in that regard. Well, the government does that from a practical level through a series of mechanisms. So, for example, there's a thing called the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and if you look in the Federal Acquisition Regulation at FAR Part 4, they've created a thing called a CAGE code. And this is a commercial and government entity code that identifies vendors in a way that the government embraces, and which is basically open data that the government uses and requires contractors to implement. There's another number called the Procurement Instrument Identifier, or the PID. Again, that's FAR Part 4.1. That is a specific identifier that outlines what the contract is, the type of contract, where the money came from, how that money is to be obligated, and the date of it. And these, again, public domain identifier numbers. And then there's a third piece of this puzzle, which is a thing called the DUNS number. And the DUNS number is an assignment to individual contractors, which tracks their work and their activities through the acquisition process. These three things, two public, one private, work together to drive acquisition success and acquisition oversight. And each of the three play a critical role in the process. I think it's a good example of hybrid data, where you take public pieces and private pieces and you put them together to drive an outcome of an innovative new approach to affect a specific public policy outcome. And you need access to all of that. And my concern with the current thinking and the momentum of the open government movement is if all government data that is either used or consumed or embraced is required to be put into the public domain, then private sector organizers and owners of data will cease to do business with the government. Waze, in the context of the Department of Transportation initiative, is probably going to not want to deed the Waze data for that program to the public domain. Intellectual property rights matter. And if you're going to have quality, curated data, someone's got to pay for it. Even the government, by the way, have strong programs where they put proprietary rights and licensing restrictions on public data. Perhaps the best example is NIST, which has a series of scientific catalogs. These have a specific statutory authorization that requires NIST to issue them under license where the government holds the intellectual property rights. Why? Because it costs a lot of money to keep this reference data, these reference data sets and this library up to date, modern, curated, and thorough. And so that's the way that NIST does. So the government acknowledges this in its own day-to-day activities. So I embrace the open government movement. I embrace innovation. I certainly embrace transparency. 10 years at both the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee and on OGR, this has been something that I think is critical. But what I would like to suggest is that as we move from data itself to actionable information, which is where we want to be, that we be more nuanced in our approach to the balance of public and private data, particularly in the context where they come together and create hybrid data. And I don't think tech mandates or specific proscriptive requirements in statute, I believe they will be overtaken by events. I believe that the technology will transform and evolve, and I believe they'll become obsolete. But more important, I believe that those vendors and those private companies that have invested millions of dollars in quality data, irrespective of the nature of it, whether it's Bloomberg or anything else that you can think of, have core constitutional rights around intellectual property and confidentiality and the like. And that's my point, and that's the basis of my white paper, that it's time, I believe, to be a little more nuanced. So,
I agree. Thank you, Rich. It's intimidating to follow you. I have been, as David was quick to say, at this a long time. And I think we're coming out of a period of, though a lot of activity around government transparency, also a lot of stagnation. We had, in the early 2000s, the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act and the launch of USA Spending. There was a period of time after that during which we were getting our ducks in a row, improving data standardization, improving the usefulness of USA Spending, so that we could unlock the value of a lot of the data we posted. There's also data sets that were thrown to the public for their use, much more data available than ever before. And in partnership with the Data Foundation, we're a proud member of the Data Coalition. The Data Foundation does an annual report that assesses the state of the union of open data, just sort of to get a baseline of where we are and where we've come from the previous year. And that report generally shows consensus that we've had increased standardization, increased availability of data, much more is published than in the past, but also agreement that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and that leadership is key should we expand open data, expand transparency, and get to a place where we're improving the usefulness of government data. I was a proud member of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking that both Rich and the Congressman mentioned. And the genesis of that, you know, a lot of my energies during my career have been focused on improving the performance of government programs. Because if you evaluate programs rigorously, you generally find that they're not working. So it's safe to say that most of of what the government invests in today is not having the intended impact. And there are lots of programs that you can say that about, for which we have evidence. Unfortunately, there are very few programs for which we have evidence. You've got programs like Even Start, which is intended to improve literacy in the homes of underprivileged children. Study after study shows that people in the program do more poorly on standardized tests than those outside of the program. You compare that to a program like the Nurse Family Partnership, where you put a registered nurse in the home of an underprivileged newborn, and you get a number of important improvements in outcomes like education, health, income, recidivism. Again, unfortunately, the vast majority of programs in which the government's currently investing don't have that kind of evidence. So that was the genesis of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy. How can we unlock insights from data we have at our disposal to improve learning about programs, and fix what we know to be broke and stop investing in those things we know not to be working. After about 18 months of deliberation, the commission came up with a number of recommendations. Anoint a chief evaluation officer in agencies, the purpose of which is to come up with the key questions you want answered about that agency's mission and its programs. Appoint a chief data officer, the purpose of which is to facilitate inventories of current data sets, improvement in the quality of the data that the agency has, but perhaps more importantly, negotiate, track interagency agreements that allow you to share data across agencies. And then finally, establish a national secure data service. We interviewed countries across the globe, all of whom have vastly different ways of doing this kind of thing. Some have totally open societies, and this kind of data is available pretty easily. Others require that you, and we saw a demonstration of this, have a secure pod, literally something that looks like out of EPA, where you lock yourself in a device, and that's the only location in which you can share this kind of very sensitive data. We simply recommended the establishment of a national secure data service, the purpose of which is to facilitate interagency agreements for data sharing, help link these data sets for whatever purpose it is you're trying to use the data, and then make sure you don't go away with these linked data sets of some of the most sensitive information about the American people. Congressman, I didn't know this before today, but he led the floor debate on the bill, seeks to codify a number of these recommendations: creation or anointment of a chief evaluation officer and the establishment of a chief data officer. Called a down payment on some of these deeper recommendations, but ones that we really think are really important. It's passed the House, currently under consideration in the Senate, and hope to see it enacted soon. It'll be the beginning of a new age, I think, in the use or the conversion of this data to much more actionable intelligence about what's working, what's not, and what we need to do to improve.
Well, thanks. That's two very knowledgeable gentlemen sitting to my right here. And my name's Adam Huftalen, and I work for RELX Group. We're the parent, as David alluded to, of better-known brands. One of them is LexisNexis. Many of you are familiar with LexisNexis, especially if you've done legal work or risk work. But LexisNexis is, in fact, a business that is founded on its ability to access public data. So from its very beginning, the value that LexisNexis brings is it goes around to every county courthouse, in fact, whether it's local or federal, and collects publicly accessible data. Used to digitize it, now that's done mostly for us, and so that's helpful. But then curates it in a way that's even more actionable and usable for our clients. And that's really the goal of all our business suites. We want to enable folks to make better decisions through information and data. So that's one great example. Another great example, and we talked a little bit about Rich's Ways example, which is safety, slightly different side, but taking advantage of, again, local data that's made available. You just have to know where to go and get it, and that's sometimes the problem. But one example here is a company of ours called Bear Analytics. They go to police departments and are able to digitize police reports for criminal activity, for example. And so they're able to then use that, digitize it, and show a visual representation of patterns of crime, for example, for the police that make these reports in the first place. So just take the example of a series of burglaries in a certain block radius, if you will, 3-block radius, let's say. If the police knew that a pattern of daytime burglaries, for example, was happening in this area, it might be nice to put a police squad car on the corner at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon when folks are at work. So that's another way that you can harness data that is there and available as long as it is there and available. Folks here have mentioned the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. LexisNexis is also a member of the Data Coalition, and we're very supportive of the end goals there. I think I share Rich's cautionary tale, however. It's really important to understand what the real goals are and that we don't create unintended consequences. And some of the ways that we've seen that happen are twofold. Number one, and I think Rich covered this, but this is a serious concern of ours, is that there are property rights at stake. In fact, privacy gets the lion's share of the debate, but property is as important and deserves its fair share. And I think that, as with the Bear Analytics example of preventing daytime burglaries, but also the Waze example, those are two great examples of where private data and public data can come together to make others more aware of what's going on and avoid problems. And I think we all benefit from that. The other issue that we see arise here on the property side is the idea that data and content, for example, in particular copyrighted content, are conflated. We see that in a few places, and it's important to make sure that we distinguish from the two. And I think that, as Rich pointed out, that's a more recent phenomenon in the open data movement as we see more data and information in digital format. The unintended consequences that we do see are when content, or data for that matter, weave in and out of government, simply because the government has access to or a license for data or content doesn't mean that belongs to the government, and so therefore should either be made publicly available or publicly available in a way that the government doesn't have a right to do it. Many of folks here probably came in and parked their car in the Rayburn garage today on their way to work. That doesn't mean that the car in that garage belongs to the United States Congress. You can't break into it, you can't steal it, and you don't have permission to drive it without asking the person who owns the car. So I think there are a lot of really exciting things. Our company is certainly really excited about a lot of them that are coming out of the open government data movement. We just have to be careful that we're respecting people's property rights and privacy as well. But I think that once we can thread that needle, and I really strongly believe that we can, we're gonna make a lot of progress here.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. You all covered a lot of category. I wanted to flag a resource here. I mentioned Rich's paper. Robert mentioned the State of the Union of Open Data, which is a report that the Data Foundation, which is associated with the Data Coalition, puts out. And this one was just put out earlier this year. I share, I think, Robert's conclusion that it's a very useful report. So I just wanted to flag it for those of you that want to get deeper into data than maybe you are already. If you haven't yet, go ahead and take a look at it. It gets into a point in this paper, I think it notes even in this paper that for the first time it expands and looks into what we're talking about today, which is private sector data and government data, and sometimes there being a difference. And the paper notes, I think accurately that, and Adam, you touched on this a little bit, accurately that there's general agreement broad agreement around open data, government open data, and the need to make sure that, I think what I heard from Rich was, with few exceptions, government data should be available.
Yes.
And we know that the government and the private sector partner very much with data. And the paper gets into this a little bit and notes that in many cases, private sector data is being opened as well. In many cases, companies find that it's useful to take their data and make it completely open and share it freely, and in certain instances, and then monetize it in other ways. And in other cases, a lot of data that comes from the private sector is copyrighted, right? It's protected, and it needs to be monetized. Government data is produced by taxpayer dollars. Private sector data is usually, it's produced and paid for out of, recouping the cost of however the data is produced. So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit around that. I mean, I heard you say, Rich, that, the government needs to have unfettered access to private sector data. I think, based on what Adam was saying, I think you were suggesting that, in terms of working together, that they should be able to work together as much as possible.
Right. So my point was simply that what we need to focus on now is less on the data and its specifics. and more on actionable intelligence or actionable information. I think that the lexicon needs to evolve. We need to talk about getting really the highest possible quality of actionable evidence into government. And evidence and data are not the same thing, okay? Raw data or uncurated data standing alone is a raw material, but if you're going to use it, it needs to be transformed into evidence. I think these are some nuances in the lexicon that the legislation that we've talked about bring to bear. Different data sets have different attributes, characteristics, sensitivities, and characteristics. And not only are they not all going to be as useful as others, but again, that framework of characteristics around the data needs to have a more nuanced approach, and we want the government to have the best possible evidence. That evidence in many, many situations is going to be a mix of public and private. And if you want, and I think the private part of that is extremely important, and to both the quality, the timeliness, and the value of the evidence that we want senior policymakers to embrace when they make decisions for the rest of us. That's simply my point. And if you're going to mandate that anything coming into government to form the basis for actionable evidence must be in the public domain, then companies that spend millions of dollars to obtain, curate, and maintain that data will simply cease to do business with the government. They'll be frozen out. And I think that's not a good outcome.
Rich, you and I were talking before about the president's management agenda. One of the tenets of that in the data area is to transform data into an asset. I think government tends to hold closely to the data it has, except for in a few pretty rich examples, the best of which is weather data. The industry that's been established around adding value to the weather data produced by the government is incredible. If you read a flood watch, which I've done recently, put out by the National Weather Service, that pretty good poster child for the really best kind of consumer available data there is, and it's pretty bad. You've got to wade through a lot of lines of text in order to get to the essence of that message. But if you go to Capital Weather Gang, they can translate that into a way, you better get inside quick.
Or Dark
right?
Sky, personal favorite.
And really to bring it to its essence to a way that is really useful for the consumer. And I think there are just so many more examples of how that relationship could be enhanced with the assumption that the data the government collects should be available to the public, but we should do it quickly and not wait for the government to add value, because if we wait for or entrust the government to add that kind of value, I think we're going to be disappointed if history is a guide.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, we've often cited weather data. I think you're right, Robert. That's probably one of the best examples of data that's extremely valuable, where the public and private sectors work together and it gets pushed out. That kind of led me to another question that I've been thinking about, and an area where we've been focusing a lot. Talking about taking data, and Robert, you say transforming data into an asset, and you mentioned weather data, and I think another area is research data, and SIIA members often work with our publishers of scientific and technical information. I know Adam, working for RELX and Elsevier, has a lot of experience in that area, so I wanted to kind of raise the question to you, Adam. I think everybody agrees that, the government's investment is tremendously valuable. This research spurs a lot of science and innovation. And then it's a good example of a public-private partnership, and then entities outside do publishing of final literature. It's copyrighted, and then it's turned essentially back to the government, and the government makes it, disseminates it broadly after a certain period of time. So that's a very crude example of, I think, how it works. Do you think the system's working well with respect to open data policies? And is there any, are there any notes you would make around the way that this system works and open data policies?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that, there's a big distinction between data and content, and that needs to be understood. Data is not copyrightable. just isn't. Content, the expressive, form of communication is in fact. I think one of the best examples, and is a tried and true example, is actually on the patent side. It goes back to the Beutel Act in 1980, whereby folks who do research at universities based on federal grants may keep the intellectual property that results from that research. That has absolutely transformed our economy over the last 30 years. In fact, I think The Economist once said in 2003 that it may be the single most economic policy that drove the economy in the last 25 years. So there are a lot of parallels there. The government funds a lot of research, and making that research usable is most effective, in our opinion, through intellectual property, because it gives a reason for the private sector to step in and drive that innovation. Innovation comes in a lot of forms, and I think I agree with Rich 100%. If you suddenly, erect a barrier to say that, in fact, you can't use this, or, well, not you can't use this, but you cannot monetize as effectively this data as you might be if you were able to monetize it through intellectual property, then folks aren't going to invest in that. And I think that's what we saw before the Beutel Act. And in fact, the reason that the Beutel Act was enacted in the first place is there was a lot of government research being done. Government held the patents, and folks weren't willing to invest in those patents because they were non-exclusive, and so you couldn't go out and you could get scooped by the next person, even if you got there early. So I think it's really important to see some of these parallels, and including some that are quite old actually, and that have done well, and build off of them. But the big difference between 1980 and now, of course, is that we're in the digital era, and so how to manage that is a source of debate at the moment, but I think we can, and I think we will, and I think that we can't do that though, as Rich said, by removing an incentive for investment. If the government's going to create data, that's wonderful, and I think that they absolutely, anything created by the government should be readily available for folks to take advantage of, but it's important to understand that if the government didn't create something, but that it moves in or out of government, it's inappropriate to sort of suggest that one could arrogate that.
I'm glad you raised the Beutel Act. As a note, I was not around then. I did not work on the Beutel Act, so that preceded me, and I think it goes for Robert as well. So it's a great piece of legislation that I think is defined, as you said, Adam. How the government has worked with the private sector and spurred innovation. And just a note for folks in the room, the administration is actually, I think, led through the Department of Commerce by NIST, they've got an open process out on this about how to maximize this very topic, how to maximize the innovation and benefit coming out of government investments. So I know that's something that we're going to be participating in, and some of you folks may be interested. So NIST is, you can find information about that on the NIST website. We could talk all day, but we've got a bunch of folks in the room here, so I'd like to see if there are any questions. We could open it up. We've got a mic in the back. If we could bring that around. I think we've got a question up front here. Please just introduce yourself and go ahead.
Hi, my name is Josh New. I'm with the Center for Data Innovation. I have some issues with the way this argument's being framed. Richard, in the beginning, you mentioned that the open data movement is well-intentioned, but you're worried about the trend that the end goal is making all data that government uses be open and non-proprietary, and that's not true. No one is saying that. To sort of frame this debate that way, I think, is very disingenuous. And the examples you mentioned about how the value of certain government data being necessarily proprietary or being licensed, I agree that there is value there, but the examples that you've mentioned so far, so NIST's standard reference data, I've talked to that office. The amount of money they devote to actually maintaining those assets, negligible. It's a write-off on like 7 different budgets, and they're not required to license them. They have the option to license them, and it's pretty much the only example we could find of that kind of licensing regime in the public sphere. And we've actually called Secretary Ross to stop doing that because it's nonsensical and violates the spirit of open data and the open data policy that the federal government is operating under. The other examples that you mentioned, so like sharing data with Lyft or Uber, for transportation, that should happen, and that kind of business model is in no way threatened by the Open Government Data Act or the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. So I'm struggling to figure out a reason why you're bringing it up. I'm not saying that, I haven't read the paper yet, I look forward to reading it. I'm not trying to criticize, you know, the value of the use of proprietary data in the public space. But I think you're being disingenuous with the arguments that you're making in support of kind of pumping the brakes on sort of this drive towards more openness in government in general. So if you could address that, if you give some specific examples of how your businesses have certain data sharing agreements, like specific data sets that you use that could be threatened by this approach, I'd love to hear it, but I haven't heard any of those so far.
Okay, well, let me address the second point first. Operationally, it may be that NIST and that specific office with respect to standard reference data sets doesn't feel the need necessarily to issue things under license. However, that doesn't diminish the fact that a specific statutory framework was created to give them that legal authority, which in my mind was an acknowledgement that there is a role, even in government, for government to embrace proprietary models. So maybe they haven't used it, and I commend them for defaulting to open. Yeah, but I mean, my point is a policy point. They requested and obtained there's a specific statute that gives them the right to offer proprietary models, even within government, which to me is an acknowledgement that there is simply a role. But let me ask you a question. I mean, what is the boundary then? And my point is simple. Historically, you look pretty young. I don't know if you remember Richard Stallman and the open source software movement in 2000, because they were ardent zealots for, free willy. All software must be free and open to everybody. And there was a whole community called copyleft that arose out of that in contrast to copyrights. And I lived through that with Dell and working with Microsoft and the others to try to educate people that while, yes, open source software is a critical and important asset, and increasingly important as we go forward today, it's not the answer to everything. And all government adoption of technology can't be open source, because then you have what's called a tragedy of the commons type situation. So I lived through that. And so I see parallels, because I embrace the core precepts of the Open Gov movement. I embrace what you guys are trying to achieve in terms of transparency. I believe government needs to be transparent, but I think that technology has evolved now to the point where focusing on mandating specific data formats, for example, I don't think you need to do that. I think there's middleware technology now that will read all forms of data. We're getting too prescriptive is my point. So let me ask you, where is that boundary? XBRL? Well, my point is it doesn't matter, because there's technology at the middleware level that will read all forms of data. And why spend millions to require government data to be shaped in a specific data format when you don't need to, because it's overtaken by events?
I mean, I think, I jump in here, I think Josh raised a good question. I mean, I think maybe you heard something that I hadn't heard. I mean, I think I haven't found Rich's paper to be inconsistent with the Open Government Data Act. In fact, I think, Rich has said he's a supporter of that.
I work with Hudson on the Data Act.
And so I think
he was a visionary guy.
I think it's, I don't know, I mean, I guess you guys could talk about it, but I think, I don't know that there's a distinction here that exists as much as it seems, or it's being perceived. I mean, I know that certainly SIIA supports open government data.
As do I.
Isn't certainly calling for restrictions. So I don't want it to seem like that's the case. I mean, I think you should certainly read the paper, and I know that you will, and follow up with questions on that. But I think
Let's just be a little more nuanced.
Well, I think that's the key. I mean,
Yeah.
the devil's in the details. And depending on how you define things from the beginning is important. With the Open Government Data Act, they're defined extremely broadly. Data is defined as any recorded information, regardless of medium. Copyrighted content requires a fixed medium for it to be copyrighted. So there you have a conflict at the first sentence. Well, I think that the open data is defined, and then data asset is defined, then public data asset is defined, and then public data assets are deemed open government data assets, which require an open license. And that's where the problem is because data isn't copyright. In fact, data is not copyrightable. So from the outset, I think a lot of folks looked at that and said, "Oh, are we getting to a place where?" And I think that what you said about not going after copyrighted content is exactly what I've heard from almost every sponsor or every staffer that I've worked with on the Open Government Data Act. I think the devil's just in the details, and we need to make sure how to write it properly so that that's not an unintended consequence of the Open Government Data Act.
I think this conversation underscores the title of this event about open data in a complex era. I mean, I think this really gets to the point that we truly are in a complex era. We're talking about different formats and what constitutes, a data set, and so I think, I think this underscores the point exactly that we need to be careful. But I think, certainly SIIA, to be clear, is a supporter and wants to see the Open Government Data Act passed. But as I think the gentleman here have articulated, I think we just believe that it needs to be done carefully, and that it can be, and frankly that it will be. So that's our objective and our goal, and I think that's
I'm happy to talk with you
what I've heard. We're a little over our time. I see there's one more question. If we could I guess do that, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, my name is Alan Adler. I'm the General Counsel for the Association of American Publishers, National Trade Association representing book and journal publishers. And I want to follow up on Adam's point, which is extremely important. I am old enough to have been on panels with Richard Stallman and others. And
Was he wearing Lederhosen?
Dealt with some of those issues. But my point is this. In the pre-digital era, particularly before the internet became a venue for commerce, when we talked about data, what we were talking about was generally defined as facts or statistics. We never would have defined it as broadly as recorded information. The reason we're now looking at it, and especially when we're talking about embodying public policy into law and regulation, but the reason we're doing that now is because the value has increased so much. We're looking at technological capabilities which didn't exist then, but now allow you to monetize and commercialize and add value for both of those purposes to whatever kind of information you can sweep into the category of data. And looking at things like the Open Government Data Act, looking at the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, the problem is that they start with a definition of data that sweeps in everything. You can't use a definition of recorded information, regardless of format, and then think that you've somehow been able to segregate or isolate information that actually is content that has intellectual property rights associated with it. And I think that for lawmakers, it's critical that they go back to that first key question. How should we define data for purposes of laws and regulations in this area? We should define it more narrowly. We should somehow go back to the idea that for the purposes of transparency, for the purposes of exploring the basis of government policy and rulemaking, we do need to look at data as facts and statistics, not as any recorded information.
Well, thanks, Alan. I think I don't know that I think we're kind of out of time in terms of, it sounds like that was more of a comment, and I think it's consistent with some of what was said today. Certainly, I appreciate all of you staying, not just for the hour, but for over the hour. I think some of our panelists will probably have a little bit of time to hang around if they have a chance and you want to chat offline. I invite that. Again, we appreciate you being here, and I think this certainly highlights the complexity of data, but I think the passion for data, and I think the shared goal of open government data for sure, and the need to make sure it advances for the sake of innovation. So thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, gentlemen.
Yeah. Good to see you. Take care.